John McMullen, writes for 97.3 ESPN.com. You hear him every day around this time of the day. He's been all over the Eagles with this Chip Kelly situation in the post-Chip Kelly era as well. Bring him on the air here on 97.3 ESPN. John, how you doing today?
Doing well. How are you doing, Josh?
Pretty good. So I wanted to ask you to start off. It seems like some of the dust has settled after the fireworks, which was Chip Kelly being fired Tuesday night. We had the Jeffrey Lurie press conference yesterday. The players got some time with the media yesterday. So how are things looking now, almost 48 hours into the post-Chip Kelly era for the Eagles?
I get a lot of sense of relief, to be honest. I think there's a lot of players in that locker room who are pretty excited to get back to a traditional NFL environment. And I think Lane Johnson was the most outspoken, as he normally is. He's a straight shooter in that locker room and will always tell you what is on his mind. And so much of it has to do, we always talk about the up-tempo on game day and how that wears down the defense, but what we don't talk about a lot and what we should is what Kyrie Williams complained about and got vilified for a couple of years ago, and the fact that this team practices more intently than any other team in the NFL, and it starts in OTAs and it continues all the way up to the end of the season. And when you talk about a 53-man roster during the regular season, that's a lot different than college where you have 90, 100 players. So to keep up that pace throughout the entire season is probably not tenable as the NFL is structured, and I don't think that's something that's ever gotten through to Chip Kelly.
What do you think was the thing that the players, and they tried to keep it as nice as possible. Lane Johnson was the most honest, but what was maybe the thing or the elements of Chip Kelly being the head coach that really frustrated players the most?
Well, I think there's a number of things depending on the player. For instance, Lane's issue was the pace and the constant up repetition, not only in the games but practice, especially for bigger guys. Understand offensive linemen are generally 300 pounds and up, so things like that are very, very difficult on their bodies. So I think for a lot of them, that was the issue. I think for a lot of players that we saw already leave, like Brandon Boykin and LaShawn McCoy, Deshaun Jackson, people like that, and some of the people who remain, like Brandon Graham mentioned it yesterday. I think the fact that Chip wasn't very accessible to them, wasn't a very good communicator, and that's where Jeffrey Lurie kind of intimated with his corporate speak, so to speak, and saying the next coach needs emotional intelligence. That was a nod to the fact that he didn't have a lot of friends in the building, and nobody needs to be friends with their boss, but you would like to have an open line of communication. Too many people in the locker room felt they didn't have it. Others, like Malcolm Jenkins today, said it was there. So it's a two-way street. Maybe some players didn't feel comfortable going up to Chip Kelly, and others did. So they have a disconnect on how he communicates. And third is the personnel issue. I mean, to me, that's got to be the biggest one for Jeffrey Lurie. Chip Kelly, people have to realize that Jeffrey Lurie is really, really close to Howie Roseman. And in essence, Chip forced his hand and forced him to fire his friend. Now, we can talk about like Chip Kelly and play semantics and say he wasn't demoted, but he was sent to the other side of the building, and his first love, and I'm talking about Howie Roseman, is personnel. He was not happy with that, but Jeffrey Lurie felt he had to give Chip everything he wanted to succeed, and when it went badly and he didn't take accountability for it, I think the owner was very upset by that because of what he was forced to do to his friend the year prior.
We're talking with John McMullen. You can read his articles on 973ESPN.com. I mentioned that earlier in the last hour. There seems to be this great connection and a great relationship between Roseman and Lurie. Can you talk a little bit more about the history of that? Well,
it's interesting because Howie Roseman is and I've called him a shark in the past, this is hardly the first battle he's won at the NovaCare complex. If he was a hunter, he would have a lot of heads mounted on his wall, because it started with Joe Banner, but there's been other less high-profile guys. You just mentioned Ryan Grigson in Indianapolis. He's with the Colts and likely going to be fired this year because Howie Roseman kind of inched him out when he was here at Philadelphia. Louis Riddick's another. There's been many battles that he's won in that front office, and he has developed a very, very strong relationship with Jeffrey Lurie. Lurie considers him his right-hand man. He's capable of navigating both the salary cap and doing the personnel, at least according to the owner of this team. And to be fair, I think it's evident that while Howie's no Ron Wolf or Bill Polian or anybody like that, he certainly was better at it than Chip Kelly. Whether that's good enough is an entirely other question. But Jeffrey Lurie trusts him, and I think that's evident by the fact he essentially rewinded this franchise 1 year, and a guy who we all thought lost the power play is right back in control.
Jeffrey Lurie talked a lot at the beginning of the press conference. He was really trying to be nice about Chip Kelly. But then in his comments later, he talked about the reasons why he fired Chip Kelly, the things that he's looking for in the next head coach. A lot of those things you could tell, those are direct shots at Chip Kelly. How much of that do you think was Jeffrey Lurie almost using the press conference as a kind of a pulpit to say, listen, Chip, this is what I didn't like about you, and anybody who wants to come to Philadelphia, this is what you can expect from being the Eagles head coach with me?
Well, I don't think so. I don't take it like that. I mean, Jeffrey's a very classy guy, and he's always going to take the high road. But once you start to have to answer questions, you have to give reasons. And by that very, very nature, you kind of begin to sift out what kind of issues he had with the head coach. Number one, he didn't want Chip Kelly to fail because it looks poorly upon him for hiring him. So I think he was very, very upset after that meeting on Tuesday, and the timing, I think, is evident of it. I don't know if I believe him when he said he didn't offer Chip Kelly an ability to stay if personnel control was taken away from him. There's been reports that he did offer that, and that makes more sense to me. Otherwise, he probably just would have waited till after the season. Clearly, something happened in that meeting where Chip Kelly upset him, and I think it started on Monday during that press conference when he refused to take the accountability, as I mentioned, and sort of claimed he wasn't the GM and played that semantics game. I don't think that sat very well with the owner of this team.
John, looking ahead, we actually have a game this Sunday that a lot of us really haven't talked about because of the breaking news with Chip Kelly. Pat Shurmur is going to be the interim head coach. What do you think is the game going to be like this Sunday with Pat Shurmur basically calling the shots?
Well, I don't think you could change much. I mean, he's behind the eight ball. It's not like you can put in a whole new system, although I think he would want to. Remember, the week started and he wasn't even the head coach. So that's sort of that timing that was so strange. So he's going to have a very, very short window to get himself into the conversation, to be at least interviewed to be the head coach of this team. And I know to a lot of Eagles fans that's probably not the sexiest pick, but I don't think it would be the worst pick either because he has a history with Sam Bradford long before Philadelphia. Really, he's more of an Andy Reid, Mike Holmgren guy than a Chip Kelly guy. So he would want to run a more traditional offense, but he also showed the open-mindedness to come here and sort of learn some new things with tempo and spread offense that Chip Kelly likes. So who knows? This is a guy who could possibly morph both of those theories and sort of turn it into what New England does and what Denver and Indianapolis did when Peyton Manning was the quarterback, where they were able to use tempo, but they let the quarterback control it, and they veer it back when they need to. That's something Chip Kelly would not allow. He wanted complete autonomy. I think Sherman's a more open-minded guy, and while he's certainly a long shot, I think the Eagles should look at him to be the next head coach.
You're listening to Sports Bash. Josh Hennick filling in for Mike Gill. John McMullen writes for 97.3 ESPN.com. Like I said, the Eagles are playing a game this Sunday. What do you think this game, obviously both teams are out of the playoffs. This game doesn't really mean anything for the playoffs, but it does mean some ancillary things when it comes to draft picks and where teams are going to play on the road next year. What do you think the Eagles' mindset is going into this game? Obviously, as a player, you want to win games, but how motivated do you think they are going into the game?
I think the players are a little bit rejuvenated because, as I said, they have a sense of relief. So I think they'll be fine as far as effort and things like that. If anything, I think they're a little more excited than less excited. And Pat Shermer's going to try to win the game. As I said, it's important to him. And if you look at it long term, similar thing happened last year. The Eagles really went from 15 to 20th in the draft by winning, a meaningless game. So as far as the draft, it's probably better to lose this game, but you can't really preach that to the players. That's sort of that Sixers mentality we hate. The players are going to go out there and try to win, and Pat Shermer's certainly going to go out there and try to win, and I would expect nothing less.
What do you even think about this other thing about the loser of this game is going to have to travel on the road and play in London next year? So obviously one of these two franchises is going to lose the revenue of a home game.
Yeah, I mean, not a lot of people like going to London, but it's part of the league now. So I think teams understand eventually they're going to get hit with it. So it's not that big of a deal. And certainly to a franchise like Philadelphia, which is basically bleeding money, they're not going to be concerned about something like that. But from a player standpoint, the logistics of London games are a pain in the you-know-what. So nobody really likes going over there. The only positive is the fact that you always have the bye week afterwards, so you're going to have sort of a little bit of rest after that long trip.
You mentioned the players feeling rejuvenated. How many of the players who have been dealing with injury issues, maybe didn't play much in the last few weeks, like Jason Peters, your DeMarco Murrays, how many of them do you think are actually going to suit up and play despite the nagging pains?
Well, certainly I don't expect Byron Maxwell to play. He's already indicated that. That makes Benny Logan's certainly not going to play. I would say there was no chance Jason Peters was going to play with Chip Kelly if he was still the coach. But who knows? Maybe he'll try to give it a go just to stick it to Chip because he's one of those guys that I think is pretty happy that they're going to be moving on. But anybody who has any kind of nagging injury, I never thought the Eagles would put them, whether Chip was here, Pat's in charge, whoever. There's no use in playing players like that. So you're just going to throw out the guys that are healthy and try to win the game that way, and that's pretty much what everybody does at this time of year.
John, I want to transition away from the Eagles for a couple minutes and ask you about you and Mike Gill have done all year who's in, who's out, heading into the NFL playoffs. Most of these seedings are pretty much set, and if they're not set, there's pretty much going to be a flip-flop of who's going to be what seed. Let's talk about the NFC real quick. The winner of the Packers-Vikings game is going to win the NFC North, but you have two teams that are going in opposite directions. The Packers with a line that can't block anybody coming after Aaron Rodgers, while the Vikings are a team on the uptick.
Yeah, but a lot of the Packers' issues were due to injuries. Brian Bulaga sort of left midway through that Arizona game. He's going to play this week. David Bakhtiari, too, their other tackle, might play. That's still up in the air. Corey Lindsley's been out. Josh Sitton's been banged in and out. When they're healthy and they're getting closer to being healthy, it's not going to be as big an issue. But there's a lot of people in Packerland who think if they lose that game, it's not going to be the worst thing in the world because if they lose, they're going to go to Washington. And that might be an easier game for them than, say, a rematch against Minnesota or playing Seattle, even if it is at Lambeau Field. So a lot of teams are thinking about that Washington matchup and kind of jockeying for it.
Of course, the funny thing is Russell Baxter brought up this in the last hour, the fact that the last time the Packers were a wild card team, they went to the Super Bowl, so you never know sometimes either.
Yeah, exactly. The 10-6 Packer team won the Super Bowl. The 15-1 team didn't. So It's a lot of it depends if you're hot going in, and obviously Green Bay is not this time at all. But they've had the Vikings number for years. Mike Zimmer's 0-3 against them. They really spanked Minnesota in Minneapolis earlier this season. So they've always seemed to have their sort of number, and until the Vikings actually beat them, it's hard to imagine them doing it. So I expect the Packers to win that game and win the NFC North as usual.
Flip over to the AFC. Obviously, a lot of those spots are still being, thrown around, kind of like a juggling situation between the Jets, the Chiefs, and the Steelers. Of those three teams, which of those three teams do you think has the best chance of making a playoff run if they get in?
Well, I think the Jets, mainly because they're the most likely to get in as opposed to Pittsburgh, and they also have a defense that nobody wants to face. So I think if you look at the AFC as a whole, and you see all the injuries New England has, and you see A.J. McCarron is at the quarterback for Cincinnati, Brock Osweiler is playing quarterback for Denver. So everybody on the AFC side has serious issues, and you could see under the radar team making a good deep run on that side of the bracket, and the Jets are just dominant defensively. It starts up front. They have one of the best front sevens in football, and obviously Darrelle Revis is not what he once was, but he's still one of the best 3 or 4 cornerbacks in football. So I think a lot of teams are scared of what the Jets bring to the table.
Last question before I let you go, John. You've been on the air a lot this year with Mike, and you guys have talked about obviously more than football. If you could pinpoint something in 2015 that really stood out to you in Philadelphia sports that was a positive, what would you point to?
The positive?
Yes.
That's
notice how I worded that.
Yeah. It certainly wouldn't be on the professional level because I don't think there's many positives at all. I think the Sixers shifting away and bringing in a true basketball mind like Jerry Colangelo is a positive. But I look at Temple football and what they've been able to do, even though they lost the bowl game. That's the one thing that got people excited this year, and it's been difficult. It's when you have teams like the Sixers and the Phillies who are the worst in their respective sports, and then you have the Eagles on top of it who are supposed to be this great Super Bowl contender, at least according to some people, turning into a 6-9 team and firing their coach. It's not a lot to be happy about as we head to the new year.
John, appreciate you coming on. Happy New Year. Be safe, and we'll catch you next time.
Hey, thanks, Josh. Happy New Year.
John McMullen, you can catch his articles over at 97.3ESPN.com.